Ladies and gentlemen, hey, hi, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. Obviously, we just got the big Season 5 Reloaded update for Warzone. This included a bunch of new content. We've got, obviously, the Clash mode now live. We've got even more content coming in the next few weeks with Iron Trials and the Numbers event. But most importantly, with the Reloaded updater, the Season 5 mid-season update, we got a ton of weapon tuning, really affecting quite a few meta weapons that we've been using over the past couple of weeks and months. So today we're revisiting all the weapons that we have in Warzone, our ultimate tier list, you could say, and looking at what are the new best weapons to be using after the mid-season update and after all this big weapon tuning that just went into effect. So as we go through it all, if you enjoy the video at any point, let me know by dropping a like on it. Let's go for 3,000 likes on this video. And of course, if you're new to the channel, just under 55% of you guys watching are not already subscribed. We are on the road to 800K. So if you want to always stay up to date with absolutely everything going on in COD, this is the place to be. So feel free to subscribe with your notifications turned on. Also, if you want to stock up on any G Fuel products, WhosImmortal has got you covered with that 10 to 30% off discount. We've obviously got the Vanguard betas coming up. If you want to stock up for those or grab anything else from the G Fuel site, tubs, shaker cups, starter packs, anything like that, WhosImmortal has got you covered with that spicy little discount. So obviously this is a familiar scene. We've looked at this sheet quite a bit. Pretty much every time there's a major tuning update, we go ahead and we re-rank weapons and figure out where they truly belong, either in top meta, generally competitive, somewhat viable, below average, niche, which means they're good in really specific situations, and then also garbage. There's also, though, two weapons that we have yet to rank that I just forgot to put on the list or that have been updated, the CX-9 and the RAL LMG. The CX-9, I think, is more so a competitive weapon. It's got a pretty decent TTK and decent mobility, so we're gonna put it in competitive there. It's not the craziest SMG in the world, but it's pretty solid. And then for the RAL LMG, I'm just gonna leave this one in viable because frankly, it has a really slow fire rate. It's really slow moving. It has a decent TTK, but it's nothing crazy. There's definitely some better options, especially in the LMG category. So that's where those two fall. But of course, I also have my list of all the weapon tuning that went live with the Reloaded update and the mid-season update. So looking into that, starting off with the C58, this actually got a slight recoil nerf. Previously, it was top meta. There was no reason to use really anything but the C58 if you are a top tier player and a high skill player. But based off the nerfs that it's received recently and with the latest update, I think this one just simply drops down to competitive. It's going to be harder to stay on target, you know, in those longer range fights, 70, 80, 90, 100 meters. A decent player who can control recoil really well, though, or if you're on keyboard and mouse, it'll still be a solid weapon. Its damage is still very good. If you get a headshot and a neck shot in there, it's still going to fry if you're able to be very accurate with it. So it's definitely still one of the better rifles, but not like the best of the best right now. Next up, the EM2 just got a base reticle rework. It didn't actually get buffed or nerfed with the update, but it has been nerfed a bit recently, and we haven't really relayed those changes on this list. So just like the C58, I feel like this one drops down. More so, I think the EM2 now is a sniper support weapon. Unfortunately, it's a slower sniper support weapon compared to something like the MP7 or the MAC-10, so on and so forth, but it's still very good for specifically, I would say, those medium ranged fights. But as far as overall meta goes, I don't think it's top meta anymore based off the nerfs that it's received between the last couple of updates, honestly. After that, we've got the MWFAL. Why this got nerfed, I do not know. But currently it's inviable. I'm gonna leave it inviable because they just reduced the I think it was the upper torso multiplier by 0.1, which is going to affect its shots to kill. It's gonna reduce the TTK some, but it'll still be relatively good as a close range weapon. You could use it in medium or long range fights, but it's going to take a lot more skill and work to do that. It's just not worth it at that point. But it's still a decent weapon because it is semi-auto. It's higher risk, high reward, but it's not going to be as good as it was before, but I don't think it's below average by any means. So we're just going to leave that one inviable. Next up after that, the Groza got a sprint to fire increase. So it's going to be slightly faster when you're going out of sprinting or walking. So that sprint to fire time will be a bit better. Is it still going to be a mid-tier weapon? Absolutely. I don't think this is anything special. Its damage is just not incredible. Its mobility and its sprint to fire time, I didn't feel like it was being held back by that a ton, right? So I don't think this one moves either. It's going to be slightly better than it was before for sniper supporter as being used as a close range rifle, but it's still not anything crazy. It's not going to be the FFAR 2.0, right? It's just decent. It's there, hence viable. Now this is a big one. The Krig got a recoil reduction in a sense. They made it less bouncy. No idea what they're thinking with that. The last thing the recoil needs is a buff on the Krig. The Krig does not need to be easier to use, but they did do some semi-significant damage nerfs. So it's not going to be as strong as it was before. It's going to be slightly easier to use because it's not going to be as bouncy, but I don't think this is top meta anymore either. It's competitive still for sure, and I think a lot of casual players and just random players will still flock towards the Krig simply because it is easy to use. It is point and shoot. It's not going to have a great TTK though now, especially over range. It's going to get outgunned by quite a few options, some of which are in the competitive category, most of which are in the competitive category. So it's by no means top meta, but I still think it will be one of the most used weapons in the game. I think it's basically the kilo now. We actually previewed this last week. We've predicted another update that was coming, how they were going to nerf some of the range to make it more in line with the kilo, because it is a low recoil weapon, meaning it shouldn't have a great TTK. If it's easy to use, that's what balances out. To me though, it does stay in competitive, just not top meta anymore. Now the Stoner, probably the best LMG in the game when it comes down to it. This actually got a slight recoil nerf, but it was not a big recoil nerf. It is still one of the best ranged weapons in the game, and honestly, might be a hot take, might not, I'm not too sure. I think I'm actually going to move this one up to top meta based off of all the other nerfs that have taken place recently between the mid-season update and some of the previous updates. The Stoner really has come to the top of the meta as one of the best powerhouse weapons in the game. Yes, it is slow because it's an LMG, but for range, you don't always need that speed because you're going to have something like an OTS or an MP5 or a MAC-10 as a secondary, and you have that rotational weapon. But when it comes to medium and long range fights, yeah, it's going to be slightly harder to hit shots because that recoil nerf, but it's still going to fry at the end of the day. And that's why I think it could be top meta, at least when it comes to LMGs. Yes, there are some other really good options like the PKM and the Bruin, which I still think are in the meta, MG82 as well. But if you want a just really consistent weapon, the Stoner should be your number one choice. So I think it's got to be top meta at this point. Despite receiving a slight nerf, it is still a great option. Now, the Cold War AUG actually got a slight recoil buff, but it was not significant enough to make it a laser beam. It's still very awkward to shoot, and I still think it lands in below average, honestly. It's just not a good weapon anymore after it was nerfed into the ground because it was too broken and too easy to use forever ago back in like season 2 and season 3. So I don't think this one moves. Yeah, it got slightly better, but it's still not anything to write home about. Now the DMR actually got a recoil rework, so it's a lot easier to stay on target, but it is still a very unforgiving weapon. It is hard to consistently land shots, especially for an average player because it is semi-auto. So while it is easier to use and it can be very, very good up close, I've seen some pretty nasty Twitter clips already from like Symphony and repulls and whatnot. I don't think it's going to be top meta. It's borderline competitive, but it's too high risk, high reward, I would say. Most players are not going to go and switch out a Bruin or an AK or a Farah or a Stoner or an OTS for something like a DMR for the same reason that the FAL was not used. So yeah, I think it's a good weapon if you want to try and put yourself to a test. And if you're a really high skill player, you could get away with using this and it'll be pretty solid, but I don't think it's good enough for the mass majority of players to be anything higher than just a viable weapon. Now the M16 actually got a weapon kick buff, so it's not going to kick as much, but that's really not a huge update in my opinion. It stays viable in my book. You could get away with using it, but I wouldn't really recommend it. It's decent, but nothing crazy at the end of the day. Now the Type 63 mainly got a damage nerf. They nerfed quite a few multipliers with it. They actually buffed, I think, the neck multiplier, but at the same time, I don't know if it's a glitch or if it's intended. When you shoot the Type 63 now, your screen goes horizontal. Every time you shoot, you go from looking straight up to going like this. So it's just very awkward, and for that reason, I honestly think the Type 63 is borderline below average. We're gonna leave it because it still could be semi-decent if you're able to land your shots, just like the DMR. But at this point, if I had to recommend one of the two, it's the DMR 10 times out of 10 times. Statistically, the Type 63 is still very good, but between the weird visual recoil now and its slight nerfs, it's definitely not moving up. It could have been if they didn't nerf it, because it obviously was discovered that it was really good for close range fights, but after the nerfs, it's nothing crazy either, just viable and really nothing all that special. Now the MWMP5 also got a nerf, but it was specifically to the 10 mil ammo. Basically, they made the 10 mil rounds do the exact same damage as the standard rounds. I'm not sure why, because that logically doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's a higher caliber round. I think it's 9 mil base, and 10 mil, the upgrade should do more damage, but they made it not. So I still think it's competitive, especially as an MWSMG. It's the best choice, but 10 mil rounds definitely are not in the equation anymore. It's just the 45 round mag for every single mode. Now the OTS, one of the few top meta weapons, it got a range reduction. Its max damage range was reduced, but they didn't touch the actual damage, meaning up close within 10 meters, its TTK is still utterly insane, and it's staying top meta. That said, I highly expect the OTS to get a damage nerf at some point in the future. They're going to reduce it because its TTK is just unmatched compared to most other SMGs in the game. You don't really have a reason to use something over the OTS if you're wanting to use a weapon between 0 and 10 meters, right? So as a secondary, as an SMG, the OTS is phenomenal still, despite receiving that slight range nerf. Now the PPSH, this is one that I'm glad we get to talk about again. This actually got a buff to its sway and to its kick, so it's going to be way easier to land shots on a target, and for that reason, it's definitely getting bumped up to competitive. This thing can be really good. It's got a weird thing with a TTK where if you end up landing stomach shots or limb shots, it's going to drop down pretty significantly, but if you can consistently land chest, neck, and head shots, it's going to be a very, very good SMG. It has great mobility, a very large magazine, so you don't have to worry about reloading too much. It's super, super consistent in my opinion if you have relatively decent aim, and they just made it easier to consistently land shots, so it's definitely getting bumped up to competitive. One of the new better SMG choices. Now the Swiss actually got a recoil adjustment. They slightly buffed it to make it a bit easier, but it's a sniper, so that doesn't really matter all that much. Like, you're not sitting there not using a sniper because it has too much recoil when you're using a single shot weapon that's usually like a bolt action or something like the Swiss and the Car R. So the Swiss, yeah, it got slightly easier to use, I guess, but it's still top meta for sure. Probably the best sniping choice in the game next to the Car 98K. And alongside that, the ZRG also got a slight recoil adjustment as well. They basically also made this one easier to use, but it's still pretty slow and kind of awkward in my opinion. Just as a Cold War weapon, it doesn't seem like it's as smooth, even though the Swiss is too. It just hits nice and it's got the good mobility. The ZRG is still competitive, but I don't think the recoil readjustment to that makes it top meta. So those are all the main tuning adjustments that took place, but there's a few other things I want to point out on this list to make it a bit more accurate, primarily in the competitive category, because there's some weapons in here that have been either touched in recent updates or just come to the point where they could be considered competitive, but in all reality, they're definitely viable because they just can't compete with some weapons like the PKM, the Bruin, the MAC, the PPSH, the AMAX, so on and so forth, the Farah even in there. So a couple of weapons I want to drop down because they're just simply not as good anymore. The LC-10, I want to like it because I have a cool skin for it. I got the poison dart skin. It looks nice, but it's just not hard hitting. It's kind of a hit marker machine at this point and not worth using for sniper support or really anything in SMG terms. The MP7's pretty much the new LC-10. Use that every day if you're an LC-10 fan because it's just better when it comes down to it. Another weapon that I don't think really belongs in competitive anymore is going to be the Milano. They just nerfed it a bit too much, so it's really not all that good up close, and as sniper support and as that like assault rifle Milano hybrid, it's also not anything too crazy. It's still decent, but there are a lot of better SMGs. Anything on the competitive category I would take over that without a doubt. I'm also going to end up dropping down the Ram. It could be really good, but it's just way too slow because it is a Modern Warfare weapon. Its recoil is a bit more than something like the Grau, for instance, so it's going to be slightly harder to land shots with it. I just don't see it being used all that much, and I'd be taking the Grau over the Ram every single day of the week. The AMAX is going to stay, though, because this update with the nerfs to the other rifles made it a lot more competitive. The Grau is still relatively decent, especially for something like a fully loaded setup. The XM4 could be good for, you know, more close-range fights. Something like Rebirth, it's actually pretty viable. The M13 is still decent, low recoil, relatively good TTK, but honestly, it's borderline viable still. And the M4 is actually pretty solid as well. It's up there with the AMAX in my opinion. The TTK isn't as good, but it's still pretty competitive and, you know, mid-tier when it comes to the assault rifle TTKs, so it's staying as well. So yeah, a couple of adjustments on top of the weapon tuning from the mid-season update, but that's currently where I see the general Warzone meta landing. This is what I think is worth using and not worth using. Hopefully this helped you guys out when it comes to what you want to use in game. We're going to be breaking down all the best loadouts and everything in the coming days, so make sure you're subscribed so you can stay tuned for that and everything else going on in COD, news, updates, intel, loadouts, tips, everything like that. It is all right here. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, let me know by dropping a like on it. It really does help out the channel, and of course it lets me know you guys enjoy the content like this. But that's going to do it. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, take it easy, have an awesome rest of your day, and I will catch you guys later. Peace out.